In the literature of homiletics, one can find many references to textual preaching with little consensus as to what exactly it is. Some see textual preaching as synonymous with expository preaching. It's running a text verse by verse or even phrase by phrase, explaining each part of the text along the way and applying it to people's lives. Others see textual preaching as working with shorter texts than expository preaching. In other words, the texts that are run by the textual preacher are normally no more than a phrase or a verse or a paragraph as opposed to larger sections of Scripture. While expository preaching normally works through whole chapters and books over time, some say, textual preaching may work with a single text, such as a lectionary pericope. Still others say that the two terms, textual and expository, are used in so many different ways that they're no longer helpful. So it's important at the outset to define clearly what we mean by textual preaching. Here's our functional or working definition of textual preaching for this module. Textual preaching engages a biblical text to the extent that the text itself drives the preparation, structure, content, and the texture of the sermon. In other words, the driver of the sermon in textual preaching is the scriptural text. The text is engaged throughout the sermon, not just at the beginning, but before the beginning, in the pastor's preparation, and then in the shape, language, and enhancements of the sermon. This working definition of textual preaching addresses at least 4 challenges preachers face as they try to put a text to work in a sermon. First, sometimes we allow a text to give us a topic in the first minute of a sermon, but then we leave the text behind as we develop the topic in our own words through the rest of the sermon. The text disappears and is only functioned as a pretext for a topical sermon. So, for instance, we may be preaching on Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We read the text and we immediately move into a sermon on the topic of faith, drawing from Old and New Testaments to reveal various law and gospel aspects of Christian faith, but we never fully engage the specific language and meaning of Hebrews 11:1. If the quick move to topical preaching is one we often make, so is the move to impose an external rhetorical or theological structure on a text. This is a second challenge addressed by textual preaching. Especially those of us who learned a variety of sermon structures may ignore the actual shape and movement of a text and opt instead to go with what we see as a more creative structure. We end up then with a hybrid structure, the one in the text itself and the one we're imposing on the text. As we go with our chosen structure, the sermon may flow in a way not consistent with the biblical text. This can be confusing for the listener and for the preacher, working with 2 structures at the same time. This, by the way, doesn't preclude us from preaching a narrative sermon on a text like Hebrews 11:1. It begs the preacher, though, to unfold the narratives in a way which honors the structure or flow of the text. We'll come back to textual preaching and structure later in this module. Hebrews 11:1 flows from faith as the substance of hope to faith as the assurance of what cannot be seen. That flow can be honored as we bring all our rhetorical and theological skills to bear on a text. A third challenge addressed by textual preaching is the need for hearers today to know the Bible's stories and teachings. The more we engage the actual language and movement of a text, the more likely the hearer will remember specific scriptural words, phrases, and concepts. We can no longer make the assumption that since those listening to us already know this text, we can simply give them our fresh thoughts on it. Textual preaching saves us from an assumption of biblical literacy as we put the very words of the text to work in our preaching. Textual preaching also addresses the challenge of the preacher's authority. Textual preaching recognizes that the authority of the preacher is not in his words, but in the words of the biblical text. Some might even push this to the point of saying that the farther a preacher gets away from the text, the less authority he has. Textual preaching takes the onus of authority in preaching off the preacher and places it on the scriptural text. This can bring both freedom and confidence to preachers who struggle with creativity or who see their authority resting on their rhetorical performance or their pastoral office. Don't misunderstand me. Rhetorical skills matter in preaching. Creative presentation of a text with imagination and color is a crucial component of preaching. The authority of a sermon, though, rests on the biblical text itself. So why wouldn't we engage it fully? This may be a good point for you to talk together about what we've said so far.